Ma'am, just to give a bit of background, once we finish the introductions, I'll be opening the breakout rooms, and the breakout rooms are already assigned, and the doctors and nurses will be separated into two separate rooms, and two separate sessions will be going on. And I've made Vidya ma'am and Stella ma'am as a co-host. You'll be just going and just saying, just join doctor's room. You'll be going into the doctor's room. And faculty will always have the chance. I mean, I have made you in such a way that you can always, I mean, for anything, you can move into different rooms also in between or for any discussion. Usually, like we do it end of the session, but you can move yourself into any room. I have created that so that you directly go and join the Stella madam will go and join the nurses room, and Vidya madam will go and join the doctor's room. But you will have the right to move in different rooms in between. I'm just telling you that.
Oh, I will only break 5 minutes for some tea or something. That's all.
Vanilla, you will be putting the doctors into my room, right? So I have to fidget with the.
No. You just have to, once the rooms are open, you'll just go and join doctor's room. That's all.
All right, fine, thanks.
Only one doctor's room will be open, and for Stella madam, nurse's room will be open. Madam will just go to that room and say join nurse's room. You'll go and say doctor's room. That's all.
Thanks.
Everything is pre-assigned.
No, Vinila, how to go to that room? I don't know anything about these things.
Madam, as soon as I open room, breakout rooms, I mean, the host has the control here. As soon as I open the breakout room, all the participants will be will be automatically put into the doctor's room, and nurses will be automatically put into the nurse's room.
Okay.
There, when I open the room, you'll see two rooms, like one doctor's room, one nurse's room. So Vidya madam will go and say, just join doctor's room. There's an option called join. So you will see.
Yeah, we want to click on that. That's all.
Yeah, you have to say just join, and you'll automatically go to that room.
Okay.
It's a little new thing, but because we just tried for the last 2-3 sessions, it worked out very well.
Okay, no problem. But still, it is raining very badly over here.
Imam, you want to change slides from our side, or you'll do it yourself?
No, I will do it. If there is problem only, I will let you know. Okay. I have already minimized and kept it. I will do it.
Vidya ma'am, for you, ma'am, do you want me to change?
Here, I'll do it. In case I have a problem, you are my back.
Sure, I'm there as a backup. Thank you. So I think we should start the session now. We have about 20-22 participants who have joined. Very good afternoon and very good evening to one and all. Once again, my name is Vanilla. I work as a program coordinator for palliative care in Hyderabad Center for Palliative Care, and I also work as a program coordinator in MNJ Cancer Hospital, Department of Pain and Palliative Medicine. And I have with me here Mr. Swarup, who is the in charge and the nursing superintendent for our Pain Relief and Palliative Care Society and Hyderabad Center for Palliative Care. Swarup, would you like to please introduce yourself? Who's going to facilitate the nurses session today?
Yeah, good afternoon, Vanilla. Thank you so much. So thank you, madam. Thank you, Sister Stella, for joining the today's discussion. I hope it will go well. So thank you so much. Okay. And my name is Swarup, and I'm a nursing in charge in the Department of Palliative Care, Hyderabad. So we run a 22-bedded hospice here. And also I've been working with the government of Telangana in implementing palliative care, and also being a trainer for the nurses. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So I also I wanted to introduce Dr. Vidya Vishwanath. So I'll just share Madam's CV slide. Hope you all can see this slide. So today, the faculty for doctors, it's going to be Dr. Vidya Vishwanath. It gives me pleasure to introduce Vidya Madam, because I think I've known Vidya Madam for the past 5-6 years, more than 5-6 years. So Dr. Vidya Vishwanath is a consultant in Department of Palliative Medicine, Homi Bhabha Cancer Hospital and Research Center, Visakhapatnam, a unit of Tata Memorial Center, Mumbai. So Visakhapatnam is a city in Andhra Pradesh. Dr. Vidya is also an honorary tutor, School of Medicine for Cardiff University. Dr. Vidya is also a mentor for Quality Improvement Initiative, Equip India, NCG, National Cancer Grid Collaborative with Stanford Medicine. Madam is a faculty for Indian Association of Palliative Care, IAPC. Madam is also the faculty for Cancer Treatment Centers Training in Asia Pacific Hospice Palliative Care Network, that is APHN, Lean Foundation and AIMS Delhi, All India Institute of Medical Sciences Delhi. Madam is also the faculty. She is also the faculty for integrating modules on palliative care in cancer training in head and neck oncology, and which is an impact. I'm sorry, Madam, HN India. I'm not very sure what HN refers to. Maybe you can just tell us more. And once again, a warm welcome. I know Dr. Vidya, most of you, you have seen faculty. Confusion that we have to change the faculty in such a short notice. Vidya Madam has agreed within a day time.
It was a very generous introduction. HN is for head and neck, so it's called Impact HN. So it's for the oncologists in head and neck. So it is incorporating palliative care practices into oncology. So that's how it is.
Thank you so much.
Can I start the session?
One second. So I also request Mr. Swarup to kindly introduce. I'm going to share the screen of the profile of Stella Madam. Swarup, you can just introduce Stella Madam. Over to you.
Yeah. Are you going to share the screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let it be on the screen, so that will be easy for me to introduce. Okay, so I'm really pleasure to invite one of my very good friend, Sister Stella, and she is my teacher too. I have learned a lot of things from her. I hope all of our nurses, she is a good inspiration for me and many of our nurses too. So I hope she's going to be a good inspiration for you too. So before that, I would like to just brief about her. And Lieutenant Mistress Alice Stella Virginia, retired Army, 19, and total years of experience. It is huge to say 34 years of experience in nursing, and a lot of things to learn from her, every one of us. From the military hospital in India and the Ministry of Health, Sultanate of Usman and Libya, Government Medical College, Calicut. So in May 2020, retired from Calicut Medical College, Government of Kerala. Since then, delivering online sessions and offline sessions on palliative care, 15 years in palliative care. That was a huge number to say. Can you come down, Vanilla? So her qualification is nurse training in the Indian Army, followed by the basic course in palliative care of nursing in 2007, National Fellowship in Palliative Care Nursing. So mental health in palliative care nursing, connected by Mehak Foundation, New Delhi. That was in 2009 and 2010. So authorized LNEC Master Facilitator Trainer, international since 2015. I've taken short course of on BCLS and care of IV infusions and administration of IV, additive and perineophy at Royal Hospital, Sultanate of Oman. That was a huge thing. So attended and resource person in number of international and national conferences, and has organized pre-conferences on communication, nursing issues, and home care and end of life. So a national faculty for palliative care. I appreciate that, and the faculty of a national program in palliative care, Government of India and Ministry of Health, New Delhi. So contributed in developing manuals for the doctors and nurses, volunteered and students at local and national level in this, which I have also participated in. Bit down, Vanilla. Yeah, so the achievements are certificate of appreciation and thanks as a nurse in charge at Buka Hospital, Oman, for playing effective role to improve the quality care, returned the community in 2003. Certificate of recognition given by the National Institute of Social Defense, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India, in collaboration with Alzheimer's and Related Disorders Society of India in 2013. So participation in the National Consultation for creation of palliative care curriculum for undergraduate medical and nursing students, and for training physicians in recognized medical institutions. So certificate of appreciation for being the resource person in shop of palliative medicine, held in 7th August 2014 at KMCT Dental College, Calicut. So best nurse award given by IMA Kozhikode 2015 and 14 and 15, sorry. So international award winner in palliative care 2019 to 2020. So for excellence leadership. There are a lot of things to say more about this. This is not enough, and we are going to listen more from her words itself. Thank you, Vanilla. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. We missed the last slide here. So celebrating nurses' contribution to palliative care 2020, International Year of the Nurse Midwives. A report of a contribution was internationally recognized. So was launched in World Health Day, April 17th, 2021. And here she goes. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruru.
Yeah.
Thank
To
you.
everyone.
It's
We are
long.
going to break out into rooms now.
So- Okay.
Ms. Bhavani from your side.
I think only my nurse has joined because we have another parallel meeting going on in the regarding some instructions. So her name is Durga, Avanigada Durga. So she'll go into Stella's room.
Yeah, because I saw her Avanigada Bhavani, so I just wanted to join her.
That's my nurse, yeah.
Okay, okay. Yes, ma'am. Can we just, hello, ma'am?
Hi.
Yes, ma'am. Can we start, ma'am? Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon from here. And I'll just share my screen and then we start. This one. Where are my first two slides? My first two slides. This one. So, this is okay? I can go to full screen, right? Yeah. So wish you all a very good afternoon. And the reason I put this is I'm sure you identify your beautiful country, and I had the good fortune of visiting Sri Lanka in March 2020. So which has been my last trip, and a very, very memorable one. So it was so beautiful. So today when I got the chance to speak to all of you, my first memory was of the lovely trip that we had in March 2020. And coming from where I am, it would also be nice to say that this is also my city, the city of Visakhapatnam. It's in Andhra Pradesh. And like you can see, we can draw a lot of parallels here. My city is, my city is also, this is one of the hilly areas of our city, and we have a long coastline here. So a very warm welcome to each one of you from Sri Lanka, from the city of destiny, Visakhapatnam, where I am placed right now. Thank you very much, the Hyderabad Center, for this opportunity. And it's really wonderful to speak to every one of you. I would encourage if you would interact whenever you feel like. And I'm also more than willing to learn from you, because honestly, Vanilla told me you're a group of doctors, but I really don't know, I don't know all of you in person, and on a virtual platform, it becomes really difficult to take it if I have a really quiet audience. So feel free to use the chat. I'm sure Vanilla will help me with that too. Thank you so much.
I request everyone to turn on their video cameras, please. It will be more interactive.
And so my topic today is gastrointestinal symptoms in palliative care. So the setting would be a palliative care setting. And the symptoms that I'm going to cover would be nausea and vomiting, constipation, and touching upon malignant bowel obstruction, because they kind of flow together. So nausea and vomiting, we all understand, is one of the most distressing symptoms that we see. And so usually what do you all do when you have, when your patients come with nausea and vomiting? I mean, what's the instant approach? Can one of you shout out the answer or type it, then Vanilla can tell me? What is your favorite drug? Or what is the commonest drug that you'll use? I can see Dr. Jayarasa and Dr. Prashant on my screen. Yeah. So what's your
Domperidone. Domperidone.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so happy to hear domperidone, because I usually get the answer of ondansetron. So that's what I get from the audience here. Everybody is Ondem or Zofar. So you use domperidone, which is a really nice answer. So before we go into what we do for nausea and vomiting, there are some terms which I would like to just reiterate. When we talk about nausea, it can be either nausea, it can be retching, or it could be vomiting. And these are ordinary defense mechanisms, like we know. And the phases which go are nausea, retching, and vomiting. And as far as definitions go, the sensation is nausea when we forcefully expel the contents, and with the contraction of the abdominal and chest wall musculature, we call it vomiting. When we retch, we have all these movements against a closed glottis, but there is no expulsion of the contents. And when we regurgitate, there is no muscular activity, the food is brought up. So when a patient comes and tells us, the first thing we need to ask them is, what exactly is to you? And in palliative care, the most important question that we ask is, how does this impact you? Because for us as medical professionals, and how we train in our MBBS, it is one symptom. Do you have nausea? Do you have vomiting? But when you look at it in the context of an illness, and I must apologize because most of my examples will be from the cancer background, because I work in a cancer hospital. So the impact of nausea and vomiting is, how does this patient function every day? Do they really have, does it impair their daily functioning? What about their quality of life? And what about their compliance to treatment? Because just having nausea and vomiting can cause poor compliance with the rest of the medication. And they refuse to take even pain medications because they just can't keep anything down. And looking at them, the entire family is distressed. So we have a significant amount of caregiver distress. And the patient's perception of what causes nausea and vomiting is also very important. They will come and tell you, like just now in my OPD, I saw a patient. She is a metastatic, she's a lady who has metastatic breast cancer with metastasis in the brain, in the liver, and in the bones. She is on capecitabine and she's on lapatinib. And she's come to me in a wheelchair right now. And she just sits there and says, I don't care about anything else. This feeling of nausea and vomiting is completely limiting. I'm unable to do anything. Do anything but take away that symptom. And she says, this happened to me from the time I received radiation. So patient's perception of the causative factor is also very important, because we will immediately run a battery of tests, ask them questions. But in her mind, it was from the time she received the radiation that she has started having this nausea and vomiting, which is helpful in the history, but also helpful to tell us what is it that this patient is perceiving as the cause. So in our history, as part of routine assessment, we do ask them about the quality. That is where the definitions are important. We ask them about the duration, how persistent this is it intermittent? And what is it associated with? What is the nature of that vomitus? What gives them relief? Is it associated with pain, altered bowel habits? Is the sight and smell of food itself disturbing? Is it related with movement? Many times patients tell us that I'm fine at home, but the minute I travel and come to the hospital, that's when I start having vomiting. So it is the movement. What are the relieving factors? What is the drug history? Because nausea, vomiting is such an important iatrogenic symptom. Almost every drug, like we used to do in pharmacology, in our pharmacology exam in our second year, we said, if you didn't know anything about side effects, just write nausea and vomiting, because every drug has a side effect of nausea and vomiting. So today we look at it from the other side. Is our medication causing this nausea and vomiting? And what are the other drugs that this patient is taking? What is the anti-cancer treatment that they are having? In case the patient, if you are seeing non-cancer palliative care, you have a host of CKD patients, patients with advanced liver disease who will also come to you with nausea and vomiting. What does the physical examination tell us? And what are the investigations? This is the entire spectrum that we need to know before we hand out a medication to the patient. And as part of assessment, another thing is knowing what the comorbidities are and the environmental stimuli, altered taste and smell, and most important are the wounds. We have patients with advanced head and neck cancer. We have patients with breast cancer and huge lesions. All of these patients come to us with nausea and vomiting. But the minute we ask them, is the smell disturbing you? Is it because of the smell or the odor from the wound, which is what is causing you this nausea and vomiting? You will get an answer as yes. So if we bring that symptom down, automatically the nausea and vomiting can settle. So why am I discussing all this? Because in the treatment and approach of treatment in nausea and vomiting, we have two approaches. We call it the cause-based approach, and then we call it an empirical drug approach. So are we planning the cause-based approach? And to understand what is causing this nausea, why do I want to select this drug, we need to go back a little bit and understand the emetogenic pathways. Because if we know the pathway, if we know the stimulus, if we know the receptor, then we will be able to identify, match it, and give the right medication to the patient. And sometimes you might have to use one drug, sometimes you might have to use combinations of medications which can block this stimulus. So going back, the pathogenesis is a trigger of the release of neurotransmitters, which are specific to these receptors. And what brings the input into these places, the response will depend on the central and the peripheral input. So the CTZ, like we know, the chemoreceptor trigger zone, that is an area which is not really a designated area, but it is an area where there is no blood-brain barrier. So your CSF and your blood vessels, everything intermingle. And so all your toxins can come there freely. And from there, the pulses again go into the vomiting center. So these areas have specific receptors. And what reaches these areas? You have stimuli from your GI tract, you have stimuli from your cortex, you have the vestibular stimuli, you have all of this which reaches this place. And so when you have nausea and vomiting, you have this integrative vomiting center. And then you will have stimuli which comes from the chemoreceptor trigger zone. And those are all the toxins, the drugs, the biochemical uremia, hypercalcemia, all of this that comes in. And then you can have gastric distension of the stomach, obstruction, chemical irritants which come in. And then you can have the cerebral, which is the higher C. That is where the sight, the smell of some of the foods can give you nausea. You can have movement related, which will come from the vestibular center. And this is also the place where opioids act. And you can have an increased ICT due to a primary or a metastatic tumor, which can cause nausea and vomiting. And so when it comes to these places, what happens? So each of these areas have receptors. So in the chemoreceptor trigger zone, it's the dopamine and the serotonin receptors. When we talk of vestibular, we're talking of the muscarinic and the histamine receptors. When we're talking of the vomiting center, we're talking of the muscarinic, antihistaminic, and the 5-HT or the serotonin receptors. So depending on the receptors, we can choose our drug. So that is where this is a chart. You will be anyway getting these presentations, so you will definitely be having it. We call it the 11 M's of MSS. So it could be metastasis, so cerebral, where you have increased intracranial pressure, which is causing the problem here. So here you have to treat the reversible causes. You have to give them high doses of steroids to bring down this vomiting. Meningeal irritation can cause increased intracranial pressure. Mentation or anxiety. Sometimes that is when patients come for chemotherapy, they say, I was fine till a few days ago, but a couple days ago, I started getting vomiting. And that usually happens because they are anxious when they are even coming for treatment. So if you take this history and address that anxiety, that itself will bring down the nausea and vomiting. Then vestibular stimulation. In the chemical, we have this whole lot of medications that can cause it. So you can have opioids, like we know, and opioids, I'll come to it a little later, they have various mechanisms. But the good thing about opioids is it's self-limiting, which means you start your opioid, you give them good emetic control for the first 3 days. And tell them to take it regularly and choose the drug. Don't give them an on-dem there, because if you do that, you're going to constipate them further and it's going to add to the vomiting. So here you choose either haloperidol or metoclopramide based on the receptor, because you need a prokinetic, you need an anti-dopamine or a dopamine antagonist, and that is what is going to help these patients. You also need a good cathartic so that there is no fecal load. So if you do that, you have actually given the patient a very good symptom control for the opioid. You give them this for 3 days, the vomiting will gradually settle over a week. And after that, they're not going to need medications for the vomiting also. So the importance of knowing this is to choose the medication and to give it at the right time. So when we're talking of chemotherapy or radiotherapy induced vomiting, I'll again come to that. Again, this acts at the chemoreceptor trigger zone and at the gut. And this is when all your cetrons work very well, because they're all serotonin receptor antagonists. And this has actually revolutionized the practice of chemotherapy, because initially we used to see patients retching and retching. This was way back in our times. But after the cetrons have come in, patients are doing so much better with chemotherapy because they have good symptom control. And once you give them good symptom control, that is when their compliance to treatment becomes much better. And then you have metabolic causes. So usually when you have, say, a patient with carcinoma cervix, an advanced carcinoma cervix, she has suddenly walked into my OPD and she says, I am unable to hold anything. I drink water and I am vomiting. So the first thought that comes into our head at that time is she in renal failure? Because this could very well be an obstructive uropathy, because she is an advanced cancer cervix, and now this could be an renal failure because of obstructive uropathy. So when we know the mechanisms, when we know the reasons, our whole approach to symptom management changes and we are able to do a much better job. And we should never forget our microbes. You can have esophagitis, gastritis, you can have sepsis, all of this which can cause vomiting. The commonest thing I see in the OPD is candidiasis. Patient is presenting with vomiting. Patient is refusing to eat. He's already got head and neck cancer. He's probably got some amount of trismus, and he's refusing to eat. Someone wants to push a Ryle's tube, but no one wants to shine a torch into that mouth. The minute you shine a torch in that oral cavity, you have picked your reason. And there, if you give him a good course of antifungals, he comes back thanking you. So identifying the cause is very, very, very important. And then the NSAIDs, the medications that we give, not so much with the opioids, but whenever we add NSAIDs in our treatment regime, we always add a gastroprotective agent. Because if we don't do that, you are going to have a patient who's going to come back to you with retching. And then, of course, we come to obstruction, which I will be doing towards the end. And so obstruction, mechanical obstruction is an important cause of vomiting. You have to keep your mind open for it. So when you have a patient with, say, carcinoma, ovary carcinoma, colon, come to you with this kind of vomiting, or even a GI cancer, you have to think of obstruction. And then any of the motility related issues, our own procedures can cause nausea and vomiting. So motility related. So identifying the cause, remembering these 11 M's, so that when you assess the patient, you can assess along these lines, and finding the cause can be very, very helpful. Opioid-induced nausea is something we have to be so proactive about. And even before the patient gets nausea, you have to tell them, I'm giving you this medication, it will cause nausea. That's the bad side. But the good side is that I'm going to give you medication for about 3 days. If you take it, you're going to be fine after that. Because it affects the CTZ, there is increase in the vestibular sensitivity, there is delayed gastric emptying, you can have constipation. So every pathway is involved. So here you need to manage the constipation first. And as I mentioned, the drugs of choice, haloperidol, metoclopramide. And another thing is, if the patient is having nausea, which is not related to the disease, you could reduce the opioids. And if nausea is a major issue, you might have to continue antiemetics, you might have to combine antiemetics, you might have to switch the opioids, but please do not stop the opioids. Because the first reflex that we learned in medicine was, if a drug is causing nausea, stop the medicine. But if you stop the opioid, the patient is going to land up in pain crisis. So we have to learn to balance. We have to be able to give them the opioid, and we also have to learn to manage the side effect. Then when we come to chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, here again, you have the NK receptors, the 5-HT and the dopamine receptors. And that is why we have the cetrons work so well, your aprepitant works so well, and your steroids work so well here. So when we talk about chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, we talk of an acute event, which happens in the first 24 hours, and then a delayed, which will occur about 24 hours after you take the chemotherapy. So even the medications, there is a difference. There are various guidelines that are there for this. So usually the NCCN guidelines or the MASC guidelines are followed. You can have breakthrough nausea and vomiting. So for that, so here, like you will see, there is a row, you will see a lot of 5-HT3 antagonists being used. So this is where your on-dem can be very, very helpful, and steroids and aprepitant. And refractory vomiting, you could use olanzapine, you can use promethazine, you can use any of these medications. Anticipatory vomiting. Now, anticipatory vomiting is something you have to get from the history. Why is she vomit before she comes to chemotherapy? So that is where a little bit of conversation, talking to the patient, understanding what they want is also very important. So these are some of the drugs. I'm sure many of you will know. You will have your own protocols in the hospitals that you work. So being aware that you can have drugs which are very emetogenic, of high emetogenicity, moderate, low, and minimal emetogenicity is important, because then you know that this drug is going in, that I can expect this level of nausea and vomiting. So these are some of the guidelines. I'm not going to read all of this. It's just for information. And it's important that you know that this exists even in radiation, what is high risk, what is moderate risk, which part of the body, what is low risk and what is minimal risk. So if it's an entire body radiation, you're going to be at much higher risk. Whereas if it is in the upper abdomen, again, the risk is moderate or even close to high. Brain, head and neck is a little lower. And if you are going to give radiation in the extremities or in the breast, that comes under the minimal risk for nausea and vomiting. So we keep talking about giving dexamethasone and steroids in nausea and vomiting. Why do we give it? Because it reduces the potency of the CTZ, and it reduces the neuronal content of GABA. It reduces the inflammation and the pressure on the nerves. So because of all of this, dexamethasone works very, very well in bringing down vomiting and nausea. And now we use olanzapine very commonly. I'm sure you will be using it too in your setup. So this is actually an antipsychotic, but it blocks several receptors. And so like I told you in the beginning, you have a cause-based approach, you have an empirical approach. So suppose you are at that stage where there is intractable vomiting, you are just not able to control it. And that is when a drug like olanzapine can be very, very helpful. And now olanzapine is also part of the chemotherapy protocol. And so we give olanzapine to patients even after chemotherapy because it really works well with them. So this is the single drug approach that we can have. But besides knowing the drugs which are associated with nausea and vomiting, what we also need to know is how do we correct the correctable causes? Never forget that. So if it has gastritis or constipation, raised ICT, candidiasis, if they have a metabolic problem, we need wound odor. Very, very, very important. There is a very nice paper. I can share it with Vanilla, and I think it's really worth reading as to how we can control wound odor. And once we do this, then correcting the correctables, if we start with this, then it can be immensely beneficial to the patient. And non-pharmacological. Like in palliative care, we always have a pharmacological approach and a non-pharmacological approach. So when we talk of a calm environment, small frequent feeds, oral hygiene, positioning, the kind of meals, the avoiding strong smelling food, fresh air, all of this are instructions that we can talk to the patient and the caregiver so that there is a little more control in the situation. Otherwise, it can be extremely distressing for the caregiver to be watching this happening day in and day out and just not finding a way. And distractions, this is when psycho-oncology can help. You can have distractions, you can have therapy, it can be used with the antiemetics to promote relaxation. And this actually enhances feelings of control and reduces the helplessness that is caused. Because whenever we are talking of a symptom in palliative care, what is very different is it is not something that will go away in a day. It is going to stay with the patient lifelong. So that's why one way to explain symptom management is I usually ask our, whoever is who's listening, that have you tried to hold a glass of water in your hand? It's very easy, right? You just stretch your hand and hold the glass of water. How difficult is that? I'm sure all of you will think it's easy, but try to hold that glass of water 24/7, 365 days of the year. That is the burden of a symptom in chronic disease. So what may seem as just nausea and vomiting to you as a physician is a burden to that patient that they are carrying 24/7, because the cause is never going away. So whatever we are trying to do is cushioning its effect, is trying to make them feel better with some kind of medication, distraction, non-pharmacological approaches. So to summarize nausea and vomiting, treat the cause if it's possible and if it's appropriate, and then use non-pharmacologic measures and identify the pathway. And like we say, choose wisely, like the drug and the route, use adequate regular doses, and try and combine medication whenever it is necessary. So this is just to wake all of you up. So I'm just giving you this case scenario. So this is a lady, a 50-year-old lady with breast cancer. So can you tell me, along the trajectory of her illness, what could be the different causes of nausea and vomiting? Can I stop share for a minute, Vanilla?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
So that way, at least I get to see everyone. So this is, so say we have a 50-year-old lady and she has breast cancer. So we are starting right in the beginning. She has walked into our OPD. So can you all think and tell me about causes of nausea and vomiting and what medications you would give along the course of her treatment? Any of you can start.
Speak, or you can also put your answers in the chat. So we'll
Yeah,
read it
you
for
could use the chat or you could talk. It would be nice to hear some voices. And konjam Tamil theriyum, but I don't know if that Tamil is your Tamil. So
It will be nice, ma'am. A bit of Tamil interaction. I love it.
I have a mixed Tamil because I come from the border of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So mine is a very mixed Tamil. So I don't want to sound like a school teacher. Yes, cancer itself and the metastasis is disease. So Shobika, you have said that this patient, so she has come into your OPD on day 1 and with pain. Okay, let's assume, let's give it a start somewhere. So you have given her medications for her pain. And what is the medication that you would like to choose? What is your first choice of medication, Shobika, when someone comes with pain related to cancer? Do you have access to tramadol or tapentadol or paracetamol? Said, what's your first line? What do you use?
Ma'am, you can unmute and speak. You're muted. Please unmute and speak. Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah. Shobika.
Maybe tramadol or brutal.
All right. So you will use tramadol. So how do you usually give your patient tramadol? So you give them oral dose, you give them?
Oral.
Oral. So what's the
Yes.
dose that you usually start with?
100 BD.
100 BD. And with that, what else do you give?
Maybe we can go for paracetamol also. Maybe 4 hourly or 6 hourly dose. For
Okay.
tramadol, usually we do, and we should give some antiemetic when we are starting tramadol.
Excellent.
And maybe we can go for ondansetron as well, because okay. Maybe
okay,
because the cancer, maybe because of the cancer itself, they won't be having a proper meal, so that might cause gastric irritation, and
Very
because
true.
of gastritis they might have this. So
Very
because of that, maybe we can start an omeprazole and ondansetron.
All right. So Shobika, you gave me 2 reasons already, right? So your patient has probably she's taking over-the-counter drugs, and over-the-counter usually are NSAIDs. So they give them combinations. In our setting, they usually give them, say, an aceclofenac paracetamol or a diclofenac, or they will take this over-the-counter. And like you rightly said, they will not be giving them a gastroprotective. So the gastritis can cause the vomiting. So there, one of the thoughts in your mind should be, can I give them, like what you said, a PPI, okay, which you would like to give them, and which will again bring that symptom. Next, me that you would like to give her tramadol. So now, in the context of what we just learned, what antiemetic would you choose if you wanted to start an opioid? So where do the opioids act? So which is the receptor that you want to target now? So will ondansetron help you? Because ondansetron is, what receptor does it work against? It works against the serotonin receptor, right? Whereas for the opioids, like we discussed, we need something which will be a dopamine antagonist, right? So we need something which will, because it affects the vestibular area, it affects these. So you need a dopamine antagonist. You need something like a prokinetic. You need something because all the opioids will slow down your GI system. So, and a very common thing that we see is when patient comes in pain crisis, someone just pushes tramadol IV. Patient is so miserable after that. So usually, even when we give a morphine trial, even when we give them tramadol, we always say, suppose you want to use the IV route, though the bioavailability of tramadol is equal both IV as well as oral. But if you're going to use that route, first give them an antiemetic. So we pick metoclopramide, which works very well, or haloperidol. Both of these work. And then you give them tramadol with 100 ml as a slow drip. Don't push it. That is one thing if you want to give it IV. Suppose you're going to give your patient oral, tell them to take a TID dosing of metoclopramide. Don't just say use this as antiemetic, and tell them to take it before a meal. And then you tell them, you give them that half an hour gap, and then tell them to take the medication after. So that is the way you build pain control. I mean, you build the medication without the vomiting. And it's also suggested that remember the hard drugs. So with paracetamol, the dosing will be usually Q6 hourly. With tramadol, also it will be 6 hourly, but that may be very inconvenient for the patient. You can even make it a TID dosing. And to start with on day one, especially if your patient is elderly, give them half. Just give them half TID and then build it up. So start low, go slow, and then build up the dosing and add the antiemetic. So the antiemetic is working, your drug starts working as the patient feels way more comfortable. Whereas if you give them something that causes nausea, the first reflex is to stop the medication. So you gave me two very good causes when the patient has presented to you, 50-year-old has come to your OPD. Now you have evaluated your patient, you have given her pain control, your joint clinic has decided on a plan, and your patient has started chemotherapy. All right. So now tell me, what kind of, will you expect nausea and vomiting? So what would be in your mind? What would be the drug groups that are in your mind? Anybody? I don't want a school teacher and say, okay, Tashika, now you speak, or someone else speak. So any of you. So what are the drugs? I think this is simple.
Madam, I will choose for chemotherapy.
Yes, correct. So ondansetron is right. You give them steroids, you give them ondansetron, you give them aprepitant. But suppose your patient has pain and has come to you for the first time during chemotherapy. Then will ondansetron and all of this work? She might just get more constipated. So maybe for a couple days, you will still have to add the prokinetic. Okay. So remember that if you're starting your opioid at the time of chemotherapy, or when the patient is finishing, she's in severe pain, you're giving her a step-free opioid, you might have to add that prokinetic a couple days, explain to the patient, and give them a good laxative, because many of the chemotherapy agents themselves cause constipation. Paclitaxel will cause constipation. So if you're going to give them a constipating chemotherapy, a constipating pain medication, and not give them a laxative, they are going to vomit because of the constipation. All right. So when they are on chemotherapy, when they are on pain medications, never forget constipation as a cause of nausea and vomiting, and of course, according to the chemotherapy regimen. Now your patient is taking chemotherapy, your patient has settled. One day she comes to you and she says, I am vomiting since the last 2 days, and she comes and sits like this. And she says, I have a headache. So what will you think of? Prashant, that sounded easy. That's the reason I called you. Your name sounded easy to call out. So Prashant, what would be a cause that you could think about? Like I told you, she's a 50-year-old, all right? And she is a metastatic breast cancer. You have started chemotherapy. She's doing very well. And one day she comes like this and she says, I'm vomiting, I have a headache. What will you think of? Anyone?
Could be due to increased intracranial pressure.
Excellent. Yeah. So like Dr. Jairus has said, so here the commonest cause is when they come like this and they tell you headache and vomiting, you have to think that this could be increased intracranial pressure, there could be meningeal metastasis, or there could be intracranial metastasis. So here now, what would be the drug of choice? What would you like to use? This has a protocol, right? When a patient comes like this, then what do we need? Or the patient has come to you with seizures. All right, you have a patient with lung cancer who's come to you with seizures. You have a patient with breast who's come to you with headache, vomiting, seizures. First thing that you have to start is dexamethasone. Once you know that this is due to raised ICT, raised intracranial tension, leptomeningeal meds. So here, whatever medication you give them will not help. You will have to give them steroids and immediately ask for a radiation oncology referral because you will have to give whole brain RT to this patient. But the drug of choice here will be steroid. So don't forget this at all, because this is something, unless you remember, you will not realize it when you actually see it. It's a very common complication. And the doses of steroids that we give are pretty high. We start with 8 to 16 milligram immediately. And then after that, we taper, because by then we have a plan as to what we are going to do. So when this kind of patient comes to you when they come to you with this headache and nausea and vomiting, then immediately think of brain metastasis. Now, this patient has taken all your treatment and she's on end of life care. She's at home. You're giving her medications, and then one day she continues to vomit. So then towards end of life, she is delirious. Okay, she doesn't know what she's saying. She has vomiting. What will be a nice drug to choose when a patient has delirium towards end of life and vomiting? What would you like to give? So what I'm trying to ask you is metabolic. So if you want to address metabolic causes, then what is the kind of drug? Suppose your patient came with hypercalcemia. Suppose your patient came with renal failure. Suppose your patient is terminally ill. Then what is your drug of choice? Like, remember I told you about a single drug approach? So there are 2 drugs in that, which we use very commonly.
Haloperidol.
Sorry?
Haloperidol.
Very good. Haloperidol. That is the answer I wanted, because haloperidol is one of the medications that we use as single drug. And now olanzapine also. So either olanzapine or haloperidol. This can be very, very effective when your patient has delirium, when your patient is vomiting, when your patient has kidney failure and then has come to you, or towards the end of life. So in vomiting, all I'm trying to do is, this is not to by heart your drugs or to know every route and every receptor. All I'm asking you at the end of the session is just start thinking of the routes. When someone comes to you with vomiting, don't give them a drug and put a full stop there. Just go a little deeper into assessment. Why is this happening? What does she have? What is the basic comorbidity? What else do they have? What could be the receptor? And the best thing that will teach you this is follow-up. So you tell your patient, let me know in a day how you feel, because you're not going to just abandon them there, right? So when they tell you it's working, it actually improves your own knowledge. And that is how you realize that, oh, this drug worked well. And sometimes you might have to use combinations. Like I told you, you might have to use a Paranorm with an or with a non-dep, depending on what you're giving. And another key in palliative care is like how you start low, go slow, you maintain the drug doses at the lowest possible to give them comfort. So you could even bring down the dose and come to the dose which gives them comfort. So these are a few key points that I thought would be important in nausea vomiting. Do any of you have any questions on nausea and vomiting? Because then I'll go to patient after that. So will you all start thinking a little like this? Yes or no? Okay, if you say yes, at least give me a thumbs up. If you're too bored to mute your mics. Okay, thanks. So I'll just share screen again, Vanilla, and
Yes.
go back to my the other part. You might have to hush now because yeah, okay, got it. So now we come to, thanks. So now we come to another topic, which is constipation. Again, as a palliative care physician, or even if you are seeing patients who require palliative care, you may not be a palliative care physician, but this is to inculcate the practices of palliative care. I think constipation is right up there as far as palliative care goes. So for all of us, constipation, we think of it as common symptom. We just ask one question. Do you have constipation? Yes. So now, can you tell me what are the questions you will ask someone if they have constipation in your minds? Just put it up in the chat, or Vanilla can just tell me what you say. Just 2 or 3 things. What do you think is constipation? Or you can unmute and answer. So the answer is there, staring at you. So we say it is decreased frequency. We say you have difficulty. Sorry, yeah? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Can you just repeat, please?
Yeah, for frequency and first we have to clarify the patients are actually they are sometimes every day they have defecation, but still they complain.
Very good. Yeah, that's exactly what I was expecting, because the most important question is the first question. What was your frequency before you started having a problem? So for some, the frequency might have been 2-3 days, for some more, for some it's an everyday, or understanding what was the normal stool pattern for that particular patient is very important. Only then we could say whether it's decrease in frequency or difficulty. So this will include straining, hard stool, abdominal discomfort. And you would be surprised to know that in our practice in palliative care, we see almost 50% of our patients with constipation, and those with opioids. It is almost 87%. So it is such an important symptom for us in palliative care. So for this, over the next few slides, I just again want you to understand what are the causes for constipation, what is the mechanism of action of the laxatives that we use. Again, a common question, when we prescribe a laxative, we just write. What do you write most commonly? Which is the laxative that you all like to give most commonly? Any of you?
Lactulose.
Thank you. I was waiting for that answer. Yeah, lactulose is the most common. We always just write lactulose. And do you ever write the dosing?
Yes. Yes.
So what is the dose that you usually write?
So depend on the patient's compliance. So only 10 ml to increase to 30 ml, but 10 ml initial.
Okay. So compliance. So many times we absolve ourselves of the response. Science is what we commonly think about. But there's also something like choosing the right laxative. So again, this is in the context of palliative care. I know most of you are practicing in a daily, in a regular OPD scenario. So again, there lactulose is the most commonly prescribed laxative. So just one thing is to tell the patient to take the dosing and then tell them that if it is not helping them, to come back and let you know. Because then you can decide whether you want to combine another laxative, whether you want to change it, whether you want to increase the doses. So when we talk about constipation, we usually talk about contributory factors. So for us in palliative care, highest and right up there are the opioids. Okay, because we give them medications, and if you opioid-induced constipation is a separate entity of its own. It's called OIC. It's a separate entity because opioid-induced constipation can be severe and you can never develop tolerance. Like for nausea and vomiting, I said that if you take your morphine, if you give them the antiemetic for the first 3 days, after that you will settle, you might not need it. Whereas in constipation, you're never going to develop tolerance. So don't think that so like what Dr. Rajgopal always teaches us, he said, hand that writes the prescription for morphine should write the prescription for the laxative. That is absolutely important. And then we combine our opioids with so many drugs, antidepressants, and there is a bunch of diuretics and antihypertensives, and of course our chemotherapeutic agent. And then we add supplements, iron supplements. So we are just killing that bowel completely. We are just adding everything to cause constipation. So a lot of our constipation is caused by hydrogen. And of course, you have the GI factors, which are the tumors. You can have prolapse, you can have fissure, you can have a stricture, you can have a hemorrhoid. All of this could cause constipation. Then you could have your neurological, so where the presenting complaint could be constipation. So when you have a spinal cord lesion, neuropathies, Parkinson's, and then metabolic, hypercalcemia, hypokalemia, uremia, diabetes. So you can see the whole spectrum here. And these factors are important because the patient's intake comes down. There is a change in the diet and in the fiber content in the diet. And now our patient is sick. He is sleeping most of the time. There is reduced physical activity. There is so much fatigue. There is cognitive impairment. And you wouldn't believe this, but if I tell you a story, once in the hospice, we had a patient whose relative came to us running in the evening. And it was almost 6 p.m. and she came from a place which was really far away, almost. And she said, I came here for a prescription of paracetamol or tramadol. This prescription, pain, because if I don't give him anything for the pain, then he has a problem. Then she told me about her. I just made her sit down, and her distress was because the pain had increased so much that he was not able to get up and walk to the toilet. And so because he had a latrine or a toilet which was outside the house. So she had to physically take him there, which was not possible for her. So lack of privacy and comfort. So asking the patient, do you have a commode at home? Do you have a toilet at home? Or do you have to walk? Because many times patients will even skip taking the have to make multiple. And because we have instructed that if you get pain, add a breakthrough dosing, they will take more of the opioid. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Opioid is causing the constipation. They do not want to take the laxative because the laxative is too expensive, one thing. Second, the doses may be so high that they can't really afford it. Third, their toilet might be outside and they don't have the energy or stamina to walk there. And then the pain increases because this is constipated kind of pain. They start taking this in excess. So you are actually creating a vicious cycle. So it's very important to ask them, do you have accessible toilet? Is there comfort? Is there privacy? And are you able to sit and go to the toilet? Many times you have patients with fractures, with immobility related issues, where sitting on a toilet is impossible. They need to have someone to help them with these issues. And when we talk about opioid-induced constipation, it's important to know opioid effects at every level. So one thing that it does is it reduces the peristalsis. And the second thing is, because of all the time that it spends in the GIT, it dehydrates the stool completely. And then it also increases the tone at the ileocecal valve, and the reflex to pass stool is again decreased. And along with the opioids, we add other medications. There is dehydration, age is advanced, immobility. You could add metabolic factors in this. So now you can imagine what would be the spectrum for opioid-induced constipation. So what else do you think are associated symptoms? Anyone? Along with nausea, along with constipation, how does this patient come to you? Can you all just throw out some names of symptoms? So what are the other symptoms? How does a patient come? So what else do you think they will come and tell you? Yes. Dr. Puvikaran?
Yeah, abdominal pain and abdominal discomfort.
Yes.
Sometimes they may say vomiting also as well.
Very good, right. So very, very true. So that is why the associated symptoms will be anorexia. They'll say, I can't eat. I don't feel like eating because I'm vomiting everything. And then there is bloating. There is abdominal pain. So again, in our pain history, what is the kind of pain is so important, because whenever we take a pain history, we actually write pain 1, pain 2, pain 3. So when the patient says that it's colicky abdominal pain, it's coming like spasms, I feel better after I pass motion, then you know that that is a different kind of pain, which is constipation related pain. You can have bloating, you could have tenesmus, you could have spurious diarrhea. So what do you mean by spurious diarrhea? This is one term which I want every one of you to take back home, because sometimes a patient comes and tells you that I'm passing motion continuously. I have diarrhea. So what is the question that you will ask when they tell you that? Usually the question that you need to ask is it your normal stool which is diluted with water and coming out, or is it plain water? When you ask this question and they tell you to start thinking that this is spurious diarrhea, and it is way more common than we think, because they will tell you, I pass 4 or 5 times a day, but it's only water and my stomach is continuously paining. That's because there is obstruction, because the stool and liquid feces with the water that's going out. And sometimes you can have urinary incontinence also because of the constipation, because of the pressure on the bladder. So these are all the associated symptoms that can happen with constipation. So now how do we assess? So like Dr. Jayaraja is right in the beginning, what is your regular bowel movement and what has changed is question number 1. Then we go to what are the stool characteristics. Yesterday, there was a patient with CATM who clearly came and told me, I am passing stool like a scale. So it's like that ribbon-shaped stool. So what does it tell you? It tells you obstruction. There is obstruction because of the tumor. So he actually told me this line. And we sent for a surgical reference because now he's going to need a colostomy. So just listening to them and asking them can be very, very beneficial. And the most important question that we ask along is the feeling of incomplete evacuation. This is do you feel that you have passed motion completely, or do you feel that something is left behind? Why this is so important is because many times we give our patients opioids. They take their opioid dosing, right? And every time they come to the OPD, you're busy. Constipation, you're passing stool, fine, okay, tick, and you move on. But you never ask them, are you passing stool the same way that you passed, or are you having a feeling of complete evacuation? Because if you don't do this, what happens is these patients, and we have seen it happening, trust me, is that they pass small amount of stool every day and the remaining gets behind. It just gets left behind. And one fine day, they actually present with bowel obstruction because of incomplete evacuation. So when we